Genovese, Gambino, Bonnano, Colombo and Lucchese. 5 families, 1 city. For decades since 1931, these 5 families have overseen New York's Italian-American Mafia, inspiring movies like The Godfather and the hit TV show The Sopranos. See how America's most tenacious organized crime networks evolved from bands of private men aiming to protect communities from outside invaders. The rise of New York's core 5 mafia families begun with early 20th century Sicilian immigration into the United States. By the early 1900s, between 1901 and 1920, Sicilianos comprised a quarter of the nearly 4 million Italians who migrated to the United States. Nearly 15% of the 15 million East and South Europeans who made the oceanic voyage across the Atlantic. Like others, they were driven by dreams they envisioned in the new land. Sicilianos themselves came across such stories from the paesani, agents of maritime companies who would journey into villages propagating promises of a better life. While not every Siciliano was convinced by what the paesani said, those who made the journey to the new land comprised just one wave of a larger influx of laborers and farm workers fleeing Italy towards both North and South America. The migrating Sicilianos had already struggled with poverty and illiteracy, having been born into a peasant life and having had suffered for generations. Ever since the year 535 BCE, when Belisarius, a Byzantine general, occupied Sicily, the island had been invaded by many foreign nations. The Arabas in 865, the Normans in 1060, and the Bourbons in the 18th century. As a result, Sicilians tended to cluster together, relying on one another in the formation of enclaves of men that would ensure justice and protection from outsiders. The group who provided the service were called the mafiosi, a derivative of mafioso, a Sicilian adjective meaning boldness. The men who formed the mafiosi were seen within their communities as proud, fearless, and respectful. At first, people considered them the heroes of the communities, as they protected those most fragile, the working people. But by the 19th century, the mafiosi grew into a crime syndicate that basically ruled over Sicily, and by the time of the chain migration of Italians who traveled to the US, the culture of the mafiosi too ended up carrying over. The mafiosi found its foothold in New York among the many Siciliano communities that sprouted up in the city. Although large enclaves of Italians settled in places like New Orleans, Philadelphia, Chicago, and San Francisco, a vast number of those migrating from Italy preferred New York. By 1920, some 400,000 Sicilianos were living in the city, comprising 14% of the population in New York at the time and forming Italian ghettos, the 2 most prominent of which were in South Village and Lower Manhattan's already monikered Little Italy. Roughly 4/5 who immigrated were male. Unskilled and without little to no money to invest in business, these men found it difficult to land meaningful jobs. Those that did worked in factories, while most relied on seasonal jobs in construction or infrastructure building. Illiterate and lacking basic knowledge of English and American culture, many of these Italians were exploited and ended up in miserable conditions, all while adapting to New York's urban industrial life. Just a fraction of the total immigration population in New York, it didn't take long before Sicilianos saw themselves competing for cheap labor in packing industries and factories and on docks. To put it into perspective, let's look back at Upton Sinclair, who illustrated similar plights but by immigrants of Eastern Europe in his 1906 novel The Jungle. The new hands were here by the thousands. All day long, the gates of the packing houses were besieged by starving and penniless men. They came literally by the thousands every single morning, fighting with each other for a chance for life. Working against not just the Sicilianos, unlike other struggling immigrants, was the general reputation Americans had already held against them as criminals, which impacted the likelihood of these Italians becoming employed. But there were those Italians who succeeded in owning businesses and were fluent enough in English and knowledgeable enough about New York that began serving individual Italians and their families as middlemen. Called padroni, padron for singular, meaning boss or lord, these men assisted the newcomers, first by helping in negotiating jobs, receiving compensation pay, and in sending remittances back home. These padroni gained the trust of the workers and soon began taking on leadership roles that would unify entire communities. Most famous among these early padroni was Luigi Fugazi, for whom, at his funeral in 1930, thousands joined in a funeral procession to pay last respects. It wasn't uncommon, however, for the padroni relationship to grow sinister. According to Mafia expert Humbert S. Nelly, who wrote, "The padroni could exploit their working-class compatriots." But the true success of an immigrant and his community depended more on the cooperation of community members and families just to survive. This meant family ties were the core of the group's ability to maintain economic stability. Giuseppe Piccoli of Duquesne University notes, "The fact that networking was central is related to the characteristic in which jobs were offered to groups. This codependency, as a result, increased the power of the Italian boss, who expanded his role. Beyond simply providing services, Piccoli continues, he managed saloons, shops, grocery stores, and bank offices. Eventually, they formed mafia families that would rule the underground of New York through force and brutality. They operated in the slums where Italians lived, and they didn't have any issues with anyone outside their neighborhoods. At first, the mafiosi were divided into several factions. There were small criminals that robbed, extorted, and smuggled goods around New York, but the mafiosi saw each other as competition and were constantly fighting against one another. Not only did this bring a lot of death and violence, but it made it difficult for them to do their business. A mafiosi called Salvatore Marenzano realized this and started working on uniting all of them. His plan came to fruition in 1931 when major mafia leaders met together and formed the Five Families, creating a hierarchical ruling system. Each family remained under the control of a boss that controlled it, and that family took charge of certain territories in New York. This prevented families from getting in one another's way, and it kept warring violence at bay. All disputes were handled in meetings between the bosses as if they were political leaders. Their primary operations were liquor bootlegging, union corruption, prostitution, racketeering, and gambling. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the Mafia expanded its business into the drug world. Since bootlegging was their most significant source of revenue, they had to find a replacement, and this is where the heroin trade came into play, becoming their primary source of profit from that point on. Some estimate they made hundreds of billions in the illegal drug trade. Historically, the five crime families of New York operated in the whole metropolitan area. Even though they've spread their activity throughout the entire state and outside, including Albany and Long Island and even New Jersey, their primary operations were in the New York metropolitan area. This is because New York had the highest population of Italians. It was easy for them to spread their influence and find more members. At the same time, New York offers a large port on the East Coast, which made it suitable for shipping in alcohol and drugs from abroad. The families also had operations in Massachusetts and Connecticut, where the Patriarca family had ruled since 1916. They sold alcohol and organized rackets with the local businesses. In Las Vegas, the Mafia entered the gambling industry, where it reportedly still has ties today. South Florida was also very attractive because it was a port for cocaine from South America and had a large market of users. Even though they often worked together outside of New York, the territories within the city were strictly divided amongst families. Two or more families held some areas of the city, but nobody knows where they drew the line. It's speculated that certain streets were considered borders, but this information is not available to the public. Reportedly, the Lucchese family operated in New Jersey, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx, while the Genovese family had territory in New Jersey, Brooklyn, Bronx, and Manhattan. The Gambino family took hold of parts of Long Island, Staten Island, Manhattan, Queens, and Brooklyn. The Colombos operated in Long Island, Queens, and Brooklyn, and the Bonnano crime family was mainly focused on Long Island, Staten Island, Queens, and Brooklyn from 1930 to 1960. However, the family was kicked out of commission during the 80s because a government agent infiltrated their ranks. The Bonnano family was reintroduced into the commission during the 1990s when Joseph Messina was the boss. The original families were founded by Salvatore Marenzano, Joe Profaci, Vincent Mangano, Lucky Luciano, and Tommy Gagliano. Each family was named after their boss. However, as time passed, bosses changed along with the power hierarchy within the family. Even though many believe that the Mafia is extinct, the families are still active. However, after the Godfather John Gotti was sentenced to life for racketeering and murder in 1992, the mob took a severe blow and reduced their criminal activity. Even though the families united in 1931, it doesn't mean that there wasn't any bad blood between them. Throughout the history of the Mafia, there's been a lot of turmoil. This led to many changes in leadership and internal wars. A simple example of this is the assassination of Salvatore Marenzano. A couple of months after uniting the families and becoming capo di tutti capi, which means the boss of all bosses, he was killed on the orders of Lucky Luciano. This is why the families are led by bosses that don't belong to the original family or any subsequent family name. The current boss of the Bonnano family is Michael "The Nose" Mancuso. Andrew Russo is the boss of the Colombo family, while Lorenzo Menino is the acting boss of the Gambino family. Liborio Salvatore leads the Genovese, and finally, Michael DeSantis is the boss of the Lucchese family. Some bosses changed the names of their families while others didn't. This is why today, all of the families have different names than their original ones. The Marenzano is now the Bonnano family, the Profaci is called the Colombo family, Manganos are Gambinos, the Luciano family turned into the Genovese family, and Gagliano became Lucchese. At first, the Mafia operated on a family level, All members of a group were related and came from the same family. This system was first formed in Sicily. However, as time passed, all families recruited new members that weren't related to them in any way. On top of that, it became possible for members outside the family to take higher positions in the organization. Family is a synonym for an organization. The capo is the head of the family, his right hand is the consigliere, and all policies and actions are put into effect by captains and soldiers. Another tradition that came from Sicily was the Omerta Humility in Italian, or the code or law of silence. All members of the Mafia were obligated to keep all their knowledge of family affairs to themselves. If they talked to any civilian or government authority, they were promised an instant death sentence, and this often extended to their family members. However, as members of the organization weren't related by blood any longer, the Omerta started to lose power. In 1971, Joseph Michael Valachi, a member of the Genovese family, admitted and acknowledged the Mafia had shared information with US authorities. Over the years, the American public became fascinated with the Mafia. As more members of the Mafia testified in court as witnesses, the public learned about the whole organization. The Mafia was the subject in many films like The Godfather, which is one of the most influential movies ever. Many people consider it the best movie of all time, even today. The TV series The Sopranos is one of the most popular HBO shows, breaking several ratings records. Over 20 million people watched the opening episode of the series, and the final episode sparked a massive discussion among viewers because of its ambiguity. Over the years, the Mafia changed, and they invested in legal businesses. This has made the organization a lot more secretive and less violent. However, it still has considerable power both in terms of money, human resources, and political influence. To this day, the five families still rule the crime scene in New York and the US. It's believed that these families still have strong ties to high political structures all around the world.